questions haunt every life, writes Andy Crouch. The first, what are we meant to be? The second, why are we so far from what we're meant to be? Hello and welcome to Restoring the Soul, a podcast dedicated to helping you close the gap from what you're meant to be and what keeps you from being all that. I'm your producer, Brian Beatty. Thank you for listening to Restoring the Soul, where today we begin a two-part series on the topic of betrayal. In particular, betrayal trauma. Now, when defined, it refers to the damage that is caused when you experience a betrayal in your relationship that damages the trust, safety, and security of the bond you have with your partner. Now, this type of betrayal is extremely traumatic, where you can experience devastating mental, physical, and emotional consequences. But that's one of the reasons why we do what we do here at Restoring the Soul. It's to bring hope for situations that seem hopeless. On this edition of Restoring the Soul, Michael and Julianne Cusick discuss the devastating effects of betrayal trauma, and Julianne will bring hope by providing 5 facts that wives need to know about how to heal and recover. So get your pen and paper ready and take some great notes. Now, without any further delay, here's your host, Michael John Cusick.
Thank you, Mr. Brian Beatty, and everyone. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I'm Michael, and I'm here with Julianne in the studio, following up on a previous podcast episode. Hi, Julianne.
Hi, honey.
Hi, honey. That's different, but I like it. Once again, we are broadcasting to you in a live recording high above the Old Chicago Pizza and Denny's from the 4th floor of the Academy Center building in Lakewood, Colorado. And I'm excited because today's show, as I said, is a follow-up to a previous conversation with Julianne. I think that podcast title was called A Holy and Horrible Journey. It's a very, very important topic. And if you are a hurting woman from betrayal of some sort in your marriage, or if you know someone who is hurting from betrayal, or if you're a man who has caused betrayal, or if you're a man who knows someone who has betrayed their spouse, this program is going to be very helpful. And we'll be talking about 5 facts, 5 truths that wives need to know to heal and recover from betrayal. And I'm excited because Julianne is someone who has done deep study, research, and a lot of work around this area for going on 15 years. But with no further ado, Julianne, what is betrayal trauma and why the word trauma alongside betrayal?
Okay, here we go. I've got my handy-dandy Merriam-Webster dictionary here. The act of being betrayed is a violation of a person's trust or confidence or of a moral standard. I thought that was interesting. So when we're talking about betrayal, we're talking about the withholding of truth or the covering of truth or intentional lies to cover truth about behavior. And the nature of the betrayal we're talking about today is sexual. So whether it be online, video chat, pornography, or acting out with another human being, as in going to a strip club or a prostitute, it's all under the
affairs.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That kind of traditional infidelity.
Yes. So that would be, betrayal would be withholding of the truth and violating a person's trust.
Got it.
Now for trauma, again, handy-dandy Merriam-Webster dictionary, is an injury or a wound. And so when the truth is withheld from us or half-truths are told to us, and then the full truth then comes out, that creates a wound in us. The trauma can also be emotional, mental, psychological, and spiritual. And many women experience the impact of trauma physically in their bodies.
And let me just throw in addition to your Merriam-Webster's, we often, around restoring the soul, will just use a simple definition of trauma: any event, experience, or environment that overwhelms you and your nervous system and leaves you in that moment unable to have a coping strategy. You don't feel safe.
Absolutely. And in a intimate partner betrayal trauma, and for this podcast, we're saying, men are the ones that have acted out and women are the ones that are betrayed. But intimate partner betrayal trauma absolutely creates a sense of not being safe in the relationship. A marriage, a relationship, a partnership is based on mutual trust and fidelity. And so when that is broken, that is a traumatic experience.
And the reason why we're talking about this is because this is the work that you do, but also it's so common for people to talk about how men are struggling with sexual issues and betrayal. And of course, women can do those things too and struggle with those things. But you've discovered that men may get help and the wives, the partners, often don't get that help, or it's minimized, or it's the wrong kind of help.
Yes, unfortunately, that's true. I've had it described as a client once that she felt like she was in a car crash and, hit by a drunk driver, and all of the paramedics and the rescue workers came and they were all focused on the drunk driver, and she was the innocent bystander and she didn't get any care or help or attention. So this podcast is to provide truth and support and hopefully some wise counsel to women who are out there, because there's a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned counselors and pastors who are not truly trauma-informed, and they can end up doing more harm than good.
And hopefully people listening, and in particular betrayed wives, will feel validated and that somebody out there gets it and understands, and maybe that they're putting words to their experience. Because so often we've both heard women say, I feel crazy. I'm told that I should just move on. I feel like this has gone on way longer than I want it to. It's affecting my functioning. So my desire, as you share, is really that people will go, oh my gosh, it's actually this.
Well, my heart is definitely for women and wives, whether they're in long-term partnerships or marriage. If they find themselves, discovering a secret life or pornography, or there's a disclosure, it's devastating. And so my heart goes out to them. And so anything that I can do to help support, provide clarity, guidance, counsel, direction, that's what this is about.
So you've put together 5 truths, 5 facts that women need to know about betrayal. And what's number 1? I'll just let you walk through these.
Okay. So 5 facts wives need to know after betrayal. Number 1, it's not about you. Ladies, what he's done is not about you. It's not about how you look, or how pretty you are, or what your body looks like, or how much you weigh. And it's not about what you do or don't do in bed. Your husband's behaviors are about him, his story, his coping mechanisms, and his issues. I just can't say it enough. It's not about you.
How often is it the case where a husband will point the finger back at the wife and say it is because of one of these reasons, versus that it's just internal and that's the assessment that a woman makes?
Well, I don't think there's any way to really quantify that. As far as my experience, it's frequent, and it's also comes externally from I've heard from Christian counselors and pastors who call into question how frequently the couple is having sexual intercourse. And that's just not what this is about at all.
So it's not about you when a woman concludes or she's told that it's about her, that just leads to unnecessary shame and pain and blame. And that's just got to be worse than the original wound.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's like, I think it's similar to why many rape victims don't report their rapes. It's because it's so traumatic and they're afraid of not being believed or being blamed. Well, you were out at, midnight or 2 a.m. or you were wearing a short skirt, therefore. No woman signs up and wants to be raped, no matter where she is or what she's doing, and no woman wants to be betrayed. And so then to insinuate that the betrayal is somehow her fault by something she's done or failed to do, or that she's responsible or blamed, it just heaps trauma on top of trauma, and it's evil. It's not true, and it's very, very, very damaging.
And in my experience, I have heard and seen this a lot, and the impact of this blaming the victim. It's just very, very damaging. What's number 2, the second truth or fact?
Number 2, women, it's not about you being codependent. It's about you being the victim of intimate partner betrayal. It's significant trauma to your mental, emotional, spiritual, and psychological well-being. Your symptoms of anxiousness, sleeplessness, fear, anxiety, constantly being on edge, being angry, being untrusting, not trusting what your partner is doing or what he says he's doing. It's not codependency. Those are all symptoms of trauma. And it's very common for codependency to be a label that's placed on wives of partners of sex addiction. And it's very not only unfair and unjust and not true. Again, it's another element that happens that's damaging to the wife.
And you're bringing this up, Jules, because roughly 10 years ago, and maybe even more recently than that, the way of thinking about betrayal and a wife not being able to, quote, move on was that she's emotionally stuck or having big reactions because she's codependent. And parentheses, that would mean that her well-being is dependent upon him. I've defined elsewhere codependent as I'm not okay unless you're okay. And that used to be the whole model, that if a woman was betrayed, if her husband had an affair or acted out sexually, he had his issue, but the woman was codependent. And roughly 10 years ago, and you were on the front end of a lot of this research and teaching, this new model of trauma and understanding the impact on the nervous system, that it wasn't about codependency, but it's about this. And that's why it's important, so that being blamed in just a more sophisticated way of now it's your fault because you're codependent.
Yeah, I would say we're 25 years out after your disclosure. And back then, really the only books and teachings and philosophy around this was the codependent model or the co-addict model, which is great if you're dealing with alcoholism or drug addiction, because many times, women or any partner of somebody who struggles with drug and alcohol use, they're walking around on pins and needles. They're aware of the situation. They fear the person drinking or using. And so, yes, that creates a codependency and a codependent cycle. And so that was just transferred right on to sexual compulsivity as well. If it works over here in this kind of addiction, it works over here. And that's a fallacy. So for many years, there was a lot of bad material out there. And I would say about 15 years ago, there started to be a little bit more research and information about it. And that's been growing. Stephanie Carnes, Patrick's daughter, who is esteemed in her profession on her own right, has really been doing a lot of research on the impact of sexual compulsivity on wives, on partners. And the data really is showing that there really is trauma.
Another is Dr. Omar Minwala.
Oh, yeah.
Who you studied under.
Right. So I actually found Omar and went to his training about 5 or 6 years ago now, and it was the first person, and he's a psychologist and sex therapist, and he was the first professional that I sat under who was saying the same things that I was saying, and I came to this belief because of sitting face to face with women and having exposure to trauma and the impacts of trauma and PTSD myself previously, as I was leading groups and sitting with women with what's now we know as betrayal trauma. Back then it was just infidelity or sex addiction or porn use. What I was hearing and what I was seeing in these women, I started to go, this isn't codependency. Like, something in me didn't, when I went through it, like, it didn't resonate with me that I was codependent, because how could I be enabling something I didn't even know was going on? Because everything you were doing was a secret to me. So it never resonated with me personally. And then as I sat with women and I listened to them, I realized this is trauma. This is like what people go through when they've had a significant traumatic event in their life, and their anger and their mood swings and their sleeplessness, or they can't stop sleeping, or most common it's they can't sleep, or they're having intrusive thoughts and dreams and nightmares, and they're very hypervigilant, and the community that teaches it's from a codependent model, true addiction model, they think, oh, that person's codependent because they're hypervigilant and they're trying to control. When people have been traumatized or victimized, they're trying to regain a sense of control to have safety. So the behavior may be similar, but the motivation is entirely different. And if we don't look at the heart of the woman who's in trauma, who's just trying to regain a sense of safety, we miss the traumatic impact and the wound that she's suffering.
Well, and to say it another way, it's not even a motivation, it's just a neurological reflex. It's a response of the nervous system. So even if she had prayed to Jesus all day, reciting scripture and, clenching her fists and trying as hard as she possibly could, this is a involuntary response of the nervous system to the trauma of the betrayal. Yeah,
And so many women actually do pray those prayers and have been told to pray those prayers, and they're feeling blamed and judged, and that they're doing it wrong or they're not being a good Christian because they're scared and they don't trust. If somebody broke into your house in the middle of the night and held a gun to your knife, a gun to your knife, that would be something. If somebody broke into your house in the middle of the night and held you at knife point or gunpoint, waking up out of a sound sleep in the safety of your own bedroom, having a perpetrator there, that violence, that shock would be a trauma to your system. You'd have nightmares, you'd be nervous, you'd be anxious, you'd have trouble sleeping, you'd be hypervigilant. And nobody goes, oh, well, you're just being codependent.
One of the things that's interesting about that analogy is that it's very likely that intruder would be a complete stranger. And isn't it true that there's been research that the trauma is as great or greater because it's actually an intimate partner that's known?
To clarify, it is greater.
It is greater.
It is greater. Yes, it is. The longer a woman is in a relationship, married or otherwise, and the longer that the betrayal goes on, the greater the level of trauma. And because it is a husband and intimate partner, it is absolutely greater, because that person has a place of trust in her life and is, by definition of being a partner, a spouse, to have their back, to protect them, not to be the one to injure them. So the wife's at a double disadvantage, in that the person that she would go to for support is actually the person who has wounded her. And sometimes the behavior could involve a woman's friend. And so then there's another betrayal of deep friendship, that friend has betrayed them, or maybe they know the woman. And so that's, again, another layer, another level of trauma.
What is the third truth or fact that women need to know?
The third one is that his recovery is not about you, and it's not dependent on you. You can't control it. You can't make him do his work. And many women think, well, if I'm not involved, or I don't support him, or if I'm not involved with him sexually, isn't that just going to set him up to act out even more? And that's simply not true, and it puts a lot of undue stress and pressure on the wives. The recovery process is really up to him. He needs to take ownership of his own healing and recovery, and it's not up to the wife to manage that, control that. Although the desire to control is likely to be there, so there's no shame in that, but it's probably out of your trauma of trying to regain a sense of safety and normalcy. That's a normal response. But he's the one that needs to step up and take ownership and get support from other men and wise and gifted counselors to help him. Implying that the wife needs to be an accountability partner or support her husband through this is crazy making. Again, to use the analogy of a victim of a drunk driving accident, to say that the victim of the drunk driving accident needs to support and help the drunk driver recover is craziness. And yet, many times that is put on wives, or wives put it on themselves. So I want to dispel that and speak truth into that.
You're not saying that wives should not set boundaries or put limits in place, or to require, for example, you do need to go to counseling.
If a wife needs to see her husband do his work, and part of that involves counseling or 12-step or both, or a men's intensive weekend, which we offer, she can't make him do that, but she can say, in order for me to begin to feel safe, in order for me to begin to trust, in order for me to believe that you're actually doing your work, I actually need to see that you're taking some steps, that you are in your therapy every week. And her position is one of watching and waiting, not one of dictating. But absolutely.
Say that again. That's so important. Her position is
of watching and waiting, not of dictating.
That's good.
And it's about setting boundaries for herself to create safety. And so sometimes that's an in-home separation. Many times, I think there's a movie from, the 80s or something called Sleeping with the Enemy. For that woman's central nervous system, right, to sleep next to somebody who's betrayed her can have a physiological impact on her where she's not able to rest. And so some women, due to the level of activation, they need to have a sacred place in their home, and sometimes it's their bedroom. And that's one place where they can go and close the door and cry and pray and sleep, or try to sleep without that other person being there. People are uncomfortable with that. Women sometimes don't want to make him sleep on the couch. Well, you're not making him do anything. He chose behaviors that broke your trust, that created you to feel very unsafe. And you have the right to ask for what you need to create safety and reestablish boundaries.
So boundaries are important.
Yes.
But it's not a matter of dictating.
No, it's really about telling them what you're going to do. I'd be happy to do couples counseling after 6 months or a year of sobriety and you doing your work. But at this point, I'm going to get my own help and my own support. I'd be willing to do X, Y, or Z when I see this.
So I wonder what you think about this. My observation is that when a man is caught, or in the rare case that he actually discloses about some kind of betrayal, infidelity, sexual sin, or addiction, that most of the time they underreact, meaning they say, yeah, I need to go to a counseling session or two, or I need to tell my pastor, or I need to get an accountability partner. And those are good steps. But then they say, I did that, and the work is kind of done. And when you talk about the recovery is the husband's responsibility, you're really talking about a deeper immersion into, as you said, doing the work, finding root causes, becoming whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very common with any type of addictive or compulsive behavior when that person is confronted or exposed that they're going to minimize, deny, blame, and kind of go for a superficial healing, like I'm going to jump through a couple hoops and I'm good and you should forgive me and let's move on. That minimizing is damaging to the wife for sure, but it's also minimizing the issues for the man. His compulsivity didn't come out of nowhere. It has a story to tell. It has roots. And unless you really get to the root issues, all you're doing is rearranging the furniture on the surface. It's still the same living room. It's still the same sofa and chair. You really have to get underneath it. Let's get the furniture out. Let's rip up the carpet and look at the floorboards and is the foundation really solid before we start to do other work?
I wish we could do an episode on each of these 5, and maybe we will, but what is number 4?
Number 4 is about gaslighting. Gaslighting is real and it's powerful. And to define what gaslighting is, it's not just being told lies, but it is the withholding of truth, being told half-truths, and being outright lied to over and over and over again. Before this term became popular buzzword and clinical word, years ago in groups and one-on-one, we used to call it crazy making. And some men will just withhold the truth and feel like they were really not gaslighting their wives because they didn't lie. But the impact is the same. So gaslighting can be intentional, where men are really creating stories, fabricating lies to really deceive their wife, to cover their tracks for their story, or it can be unintentional in the sense of they're just, withholding information, not really outright lying. Either way, the impact is the same on the person. It really is crazy making, and it makes a person doubt their gut instincts, and it calls into question their whole sense of reality. What I believed was true really isn't true, and who I thought you were isn't really who you are based on the nature of your behaviors. So I'm not really sure what's true and what isn't anymore. And that it's almost like a form of brainwashing or being drugged. And there's a fogginess that women report, a lack of mental clarity. And it takes a while for that to wear off. What they need is time and truth and some space to process that. Because it is a real thing, and there are more and more articles and research out there about the impact of gaslighting and it being psychological abuse and psychological trauma.
And there's a big correlation between gaslighting and deeper wounding and brokenness in the man. So it's not just that, whoops, I had an affair or I looked at pornography, for 3 months, but not before or after. It's usually the high levels of gaslighting and crazy making. They're often tied into narcissistic kinds of wounds where a person can't be seen or exposed in any kind of negative light, and therefore they have to deflect the shame that they might feel by putting it back on the other. And therefore, you're wrong, you're crazy, you're making that up, those feelings aren't real, I didn't do that, all those kinds of things. But wherever there's deep trauma or wounding, this is more likely to play out.
Well, and it doesn't have to be, coming out of a narcissistic wound. Again, most addicts, those people struggling with alcohol or, substance abuse, or even, like gambling, shopping, eating, they're going to withhold information, or they're going to lie to make it better. They're going to minimize it, say they don't really have a problem. They can, I can fix this on my own. And so all of that self-lying, self-deception is also a form of gaslighting.
So it really is more just common on a day-to-day level with an addict.
Yeah.
And we want to make a distinction that not everybody who looks at porn and whose wife finds out, and not everybody who has an affair is an addict. Those are obviously their sins. They are betrayals, but there is a difference. And that's where counseling comes in, where sometimes that distinction needs to be made.
Oh, it absolutely does. But you can't do that if you're just trying to manage behaviors and control things on the surface. You have to really go beneath the waterline. And I also want to say, I said addicts, but I really like to humanize it and say a person struggling with addiction instead of, say, an addict, because the addiction, while it might consume them, it doesn't define them. And, to say, I'm an angry person versus, I can sometimes struggle with anger. It's just different. And so I just want to be sensitive to that and address that with our listeners.
It's a more compassionate response. And, ultimately, we're not defined by our brokenness, as we talk about around here.
Right.
What's number 5?
Well, this is really important. And a couple of these we could actually, like you said before, do a whole podcast on. But number 5 is take your time. Don't make any rash decisions. Being in a state of trauma is not the best place to be when you're going to make life-altering decisions. So take your time, and for 2 reasons. One is his recovery takes time, and you're in a position of waiting and seeing how he's really going to respond. Is he just going to go through the motions, or is he really going to be changed through his pursuit of healing and recovery? And there's a big difference. That's a whole nother podcast. Also, I want to say, take your time with forgiveness. Forgiveness should be the last thing on your mind right now. And many times it's one of the first things that wives are told to do, either by a pastor or a Christian counselor or their husbands, is, well, you haven't forgiven me. Well, I'm just finding out about a 5, 10, 20-year history that I didn't know about. How about I have a little time to process that reality, recover from the trauma, and then we can start working on forgiveness as a process.
It's hard to forgive something or someone when you don't actually know the depth of the impact of what it is that you're forgiving. Oh,
it's actually impossible if we look at biblical standards, right, or even the process of forgiveness, to do it at the beginning. We never address forgiveness in our groups to one of the very last sessions, and we always talk about it being a journey and a process. Don't let anyone pressure you into fast forgiveness. It's just a superficial healing, and it's not deep and meaningful for you or for the other person. And there can't be forgiveness without the other person taking accountability and responsibility for the impact they've had on you. So that's part of the process. And you have to have time, the woman has to have time to heal and recover from the shock and the impact of the betrayal and the trauma, and that can't be rushed. And so both people need time. The man needs time to do his work because this isn't going to be resolved in 6 sessions. And so while he's off doing his work over 6 months to a year or longer, a little aside here, clinical research says that the average length of working recovery to be free from sex addiction is a minimum of 3 to 5 years. So we've got plenty of time here that he's got to work on his stuff. Let's give the woman a year to recover from the emotional, psychological trauma, to be able to set boundaries, create safety for herself, recover from the shock and the impact, and then from a place of safety and stability, 6 months to a year out, be able to make decisions and be able to begin to enter into the process of forgiveness. And I can't stress it enough that forgiveness is not a one-time event, but it really is a process and it takes time, just like healing and recovery for the wife and for the person struggling with addiction and compulsivity. It's a process. It doesn't happen quickly or easily, and it does take time. So I want to do a quick review of maybe you're just catching this late, or maybe you're wondering, hey, you said a lot and threw a lot of information at me. I really can't remember what the 5 points are. So here's a quick summary. 5 facts wives need to know after betrayal. Number 1, it's not about you. Number 2, it's not about you being codependent. Number 3, his recovery is not about you. Number 4, gaslighting is real and powerful. And number 5, take your time. Take your time to make decisions and take your time to grieve and engage the process of forgiveness.
And I want to just read a verse that I was looking up as you're reading those. You said earlier that you can't forgive someone unless they take ownership and responsibility. And people that know their Bible might go, well, wait a minute, that's not true, because Jesus says forgive 70 times 7, and, we're to forgive unconditionally. But there's a verse in Luke 17, and it's verse 3. And these are the words of Jesus. He says, so watch yourselves. If a brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them. And if they repent, forgive them. If a brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. And this is an instance where Jesus is not contradicting himself. There's this cauldron of truth about forgiveness and releasing someone from their offense. And part of that is that it's a relational dynamic. And I think this verse points out that you don't just say, okay, you knock the wind out of me, and I'm fine. Tomorrow I discover that I have 3 broken ribs. Next week I discover that I have a punctured lung. After that, I now discover I have pneumonia, but I forgave you on that first day. And so it's all good. And I think this is really important, that if they repent, forgive them. So I just wanted to throw that out with number 5.
Well, you've just opened a can of worms there, because we could go on and talking about forgiveness and how it's not dependent on the other person. But I would say, and I will stand by this, that any type of relational reconciliation is dependent upon repentance, and that repentance needs to be genuine and longstanding.
Absolutely. Julianne, thank you for your expertise and your heart and the work that you do with women here at Restoring the Soul around betrayal trauma. And we are going to have a follow-up episode to this, and say what that's about.
Yes, that one will be for husbands. 5 things husbands can do to support their wives after betrayal.
And so stay tuned for that episode coming up next week. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.